Okay, so I haven't put up anything about going through your guys' brackets, but I've got most of them kind of scored. So I'll eventually put an Excel spreadsheet up there. I'm sure all of us will be disappointed in our scores. But the other thing that hopefully we have working today is that Excel file. So I'll show you how to do some kind of linear regressions towards the end of class. Other than that, we'll jump into things here. You have a homework that's due at the end of the day next Friday. So try to start kind of working your way through that so you can get early questions out of the way so you can get as many points as possible in that and kind of come to me with questions and I can help you out. We should have covered the majority of the material in those or on that homework. We'll finish kind of the last couple questions today, any information that you would need for those questions today. And I think that should cover it. I'll probably post shouldn't say probably, I talk better, but I'll put an online quiz up today that'll be due before we meet on Tuesday as well. So kind of with all of that out of the way, let's jump back in kind of where we left off. So we talked last class about industrial and craft unions, right? They both work a little bit differently, but ultimately, what we decided was that the result of them is similar, right? We end up with a higher wage and kind of a lower number of units of labor, whether or not that's the number of players or kind of the quality of labor hours or fewer hours put in. And really the goal of these unions is not just kind of to raise wages, right? The players union is really advocating for a myriad of different things that they think benefit the players, right? So, if we think about what they're really trying to fight, it's really this monopsony power, right? This monopsony power of the employer to give lower wages, to kind of make conditions worse for the players. And so this is really what they're fighting against. So they're a little bit unique in that, they aren't fixing a wage for every player, right? They're doing things like raising salary cap maximums for individual players. They're doing things like raising league minimums. So, being a sports union is much harder, right? In the sense that you've got really every player you could argue is of a different quality. And one thing that I'll already switch over to the dot cam because I know I'm going to be switching back and forth between that a decent amount this lecture. So let's give it a second to catch up with us here. Zoomed way in. There we go. So just kind of a reminder. Hopefully this isn't. We had that demand curve for labor. Does this look better with or without the light? Let's go without the light, I think. I would say it was two components, the marginal revenue per win and the number of additional wins that player brings in or the marginal product of that player. So, every player, really, you can think about is going to have a different quality measure or bring an additional number, a different additional number of wins. So really every player, right, is going to have a different wage potentially that the team would be willing to pay them. So the union has to go to bat for every single player. It can't just set one universal wage, right? So with that in mind, we have these unions fighting for higher wages for every player. But we also have the monopsony power, which is that these teams would like to, if there weren't unions, would have the ability to have this monopsony power to pay them less than what they were bringing into the team. Remember, we said this demand curve for labor really comes from the value of that marginal product or the value of those number of additional wins. So we end up with kind of both sides fighting against each other, right? I think we even had a graph last class. And I won't label everything perfectly, or I shouldn't say perfectly, I just won't label everything as in depth. But we said, we've got our supply curve for labor, our demand curve. Monopsony power would want to set the wages down here. Monopoly power, right, makes decisions based off the marginal revenue. So what they would want to set wages up here. And we said, we don't know where wages will end up, but it's going to be somewhere in this range, right? Both sides are going to be bargaining, to try to get that agreed upon wage closer to what they want. Okay? So what happens is, they're fighting back and forth. We have this thing called arbitration, right? So there may be, our two parties here, the teams and then the player or the union. And so what they do is they kind of put in these proposals to a third party, right? So potentially if we have a player feel like they're done wrong or a team feel like they're done wrong by the player in terms of the contract, they can put in a proposal to this third party called an arbitrator, right? So the arbitrator kind of reviews both cases and then makes a judgment, right? So, binding arbitration would be with both sides have to pre-commit to whatever decision the arbitrator makes, right? So they put in what they think the result should be, and the other side puts in what they think it should be, and they say, okay, look, whatever this third party decides, that's what we will both kind of go off, right? That's what will be the resulting kind of wage or length of contract, whatever they're kind of disputing. Okay? So in Major League Baseball and NHL, they have this kind of binding arbitration. We both put in our offers, and whatever the third party decides, that's what we're going with. Okay? Let me take this off the screen. The NHL, right, the team and then the player or the union submit their proposals to not just one third party, but a larger panel. And then Major League Baseball has kind of this final offer arbitration, which is that the arbiter can't say split the difference, okay? So, let's say that, I don't know, we're trying to we'll use wages because it's easier, that the union wants a certain player's wage to be, I don't know, or maybe it's the, not necessarily the player, but the salary cap for one individual player to be 30 million. That's what kind of the union wants. And then the league comes back and says, well, we want it to be lower. We want it to be 20 million. Well, if you send this to a third party, what they could look at is say, well, look, we know that they both are going to kind of have their own interests. And so we'll split the difference and set it at 25, right? But this final offer arbitration is that arbiter can't split the difference. They have to choose one of the proposals. So they either have to choose 30 or 20 million. So if we have this final offer arbitration, what do you think that prevents both sides from doing? So if the third party can't come up with their own solution, what might let's say that I really do want it set at 30 and the other side really does want it set at 20, but I know that the arbiter has to choose one of those values. Well, maybe if I know that if there was no monopoly or monopsony power, the wage or this kind of salary cap really should be around 25 million. So maybe as the player said, well, look, I'm not really sure what this arbiter is going to do, but I know if I come in a little bit lower or a little bit closer to that 25, they have the statistics, to look at. They know that it probably should be around 25. They're more likely to choose my offer. So this final offer arbitration kind of prevents both sides from choosing really extreme kind of values and then just hoping that they split the difference, right? So this final offer arbitration kind of incentivizes both sides to propose something that's a little bit closer to kind of the middle between what both sides want. Right? So that's one kind of issue we have going on. So I already kind of mentioned that, right? If you prevents them from splitting the difference, then both sides are going to be likely to come in with a little bit more reasonable of an offer. Right? So just some of the just from pulling one season of data, the 2010-2011 season for Major League Baseball, where they have this final offer arbitration, only 6 of the filings even went to a decision, right? And in 4 of the 6 situations, the players lost. So we might look at this and say, well, man, there's still a monopsony power issue. The union isn't able to do too much for the players. They're losing the majority of the time. But notice only 6 went to arbitration. So there's 72 other cases that were filed that didn't end up going to arbitration because it's really just a threat, right? So these 72 other cases essentially were settled before they got to the point where they had to just accept whatever this third-party arbiter decides, okay? So when we say that these were settled, that means that the teams at least had to give in a little bit to those players' demands. So even though it doesn't look real great when we look at the ones that went to arbitration, we'll have 6 of the 78. The other 72 the teams kind of caved in early and didn't want to go to that final offer arbitration. So even this union power still helps, right, raise these players' wages, even if it doesn't go to this final stage. So we have these teams and these players bargaining back and forth, and it may not be individual cases. What if it's on like a league-wide basis, right? So maybe they're thinking about the number of games, salary cap for individual players, league minimums, right? Well, the sides can't always agree to things, so sometimes we see things like strikes or lockouts, right? Oh, sorry. So a strike is basically when the union or kind of the suppliers of labor say they're not going to work until a better agreement is made. So players are working together and they don't supply their labor. A lockout is where the teams say, well, look, the union is being a little bit ridiculous in their demands, so we're just not going to put on any games until they can come a little bit more closer to what we want. So it's kind of like games are being played in either way, but it's coming from different directions. Now, there's still a little bit of an imbalance of power, and I can't remember what year league it was. I know that I want to say it was like the NFL back in the 70s, maybe had replacement players. So there's still a little bit of an imbalance of power because a lockout, the teams say, look, we're not going to put in any games. Well, there could be then another league that pops up and say, well, we will. But I mean, the fixed costs of, having a league with stadiums to play in, it's not very easy for that situation to occur. However, if the players go on strike, yeah, they can't provide the same quality of product, but the teams still could go out and sign replacement players. Right now, I think they did a similar thing with, how many years ago was it, the NFL with their referees, right? The referees actually kind of had a strike and they had replacement refs, right? So it's a little bit easier for these teams to replace their labor supply if they go on strike, as opposed to the players finding somewhere else to play if the teams decide that they want to have a lockout. So this idea of having both monopsony and monopoly power in the labor market is often referred to as a bilateral monopoly, right? Teams having monopsony power in the labor market is a direct result of them having a monopoly over the product, right? The NFL has a monopoly over professional football games being played. So that leads to them having monopsony power in the labor market for football players. So we call this kind of a bilateral monopoly when we have both of these competing sides, right? So we already talked about there's going to be some range, right? We don't know exactly what value within that range it's going to be, but we know that there will be a range. Right? Oh, I forgot one of my animations here. So, we see instances of these lockouts, right? I've kind of a couple of them listed here. We could go back further in time if we wanted to, but every league has really experienced some type of a lockout or a strike at some point, even if it was just in the preseason, right? The NFL kind of had one really not that long ago, 9 years ago. They lost that preseason because they couldn't come to a kind of an agreement prior to the season starting. So what's kind of the major negative impact? Well, I mean, when you think about it, this is kind of just start to get us to think. I mean, these games aren't being played. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars potentially lost if we lose a season. Right? But it's also not just a negative impact to the teams. I mean, the players are losing out on wages over this time as well. So, we want to try to avoid these situations at all costs. You can kind of imagine, okay, if the union is trying to fight for higher wages, but they lose out an entire season, well, even if they end up winning and they raise the wages of the majority of players a little bit, it doesn't matter if it doesn't compensate for the wages that were lost during that season that wasn't played. So we really want to try to avoid these situations. Okay? So we can start to understand this a little bit more using things called a contract zone. We'll switch over. So before we kind of look at this, there you go. So I'll use, usually we're thinking about this in terms of wages, but I'm going to use a slightly different example to kind of set up how we can understand contract zones. So let's say we have the league or the players union, and they're fighting with the league about the number of additional games they want to add to the NFL season, right? So the union, you can kind of think about here we've got what the union wants. They would be okay with anything between 0 and 2 games, right? They'd be okay with that. The league, let's say perhaps that the league would always wants more games, right? So they'd be okay with anything from 1 to, we could create, I don't know, a wild number, but we'll just say 6, right? The league would like to add maybe a certain number of additional games. Well, if the two sides are proposing offers to each other, and let's say, and I didn't really draw this to proportion here, I guess a 6 should be way out here, right? But you get the idea. Let's say the league proposes 4 new additional games. And the union says, well, look, we're only willing to accept 0, 1, or 2 games, so we're going on strike, right? If the league was to propose anything outside of the contract zone for the union, well, the union's just going to go on strike. Right? So knowing that, right, the league is probably going to try to, and they don't know for sure, right? The league looking at the union doesn't know for sure what that number of games kind of where it stops at. They don't know exactly how many additional games the union would be kind of willing to accept. So maybe they propose something that's a little bit lower, maybe they propose 2. The league and the union are both okay with that, and maybe they come to an agreement, right? And 2 additional games are going to be played. Right? Or vice versa, if the union kind of goes to the leagues and says, well, look, we propose that we don't change the number of games at all, the league is going to look at the union and say, well, that's not outside our contract zone. We want at least 1 additional game, if not more. Right? That's the only way that we're going to come to an agreement. So these contract zones represent the only values for which each side would be willing to kind of accept. Right? Now, we still have a little bit of uncertainty in that, okay, well, what's the agreement going to be? Is it going to be 1 game or 2 games? Well, they'll probably go back and forth. We can't say for certain which one of these values will end up on, but we know that if they, either side doesn't propose 1 or 2 games and they propose something outside those ranges, we're going to have either a strike, or if the union proposes 0 games, we would have a lockout. Right? So we can start to think about this overlap is really going to become important. Okay? Any questions on that before we kind of keep moving? Just a general idea. Okay, so let's change it a little bit. Let's do, so now we're going to kind of switch things up. Actually, I should probably just do it on a separate sheet of paper so we don't get confused. So let's switch up the example where we're thinking about, let's do like individual salary caps. So the amount of money that one player can make. Maybe they're putting caps on that. So let's say the league, right? Ideally, a lot of the times the league wants there to be a cap because they don't want to have to pay the best players a high amount of money. So maybe the league says, look, we're willing to accept anything between 20 and 30 million. Right? Actually, I think I'm gonna have this backwards. So hold on. I need to draw this. We're gonna try this again. We'll go 20 and 30 million down here. So I have my right side open. So this is what the league wants, right? They want that salary cap to be somewhere in that lower range. However, the union, right? They want player wages to be higher, so they want it to be somewhere between, I don't know, let's say 35 and 40 million. Probably theoretically, they might actually want it to be kind of open-ended there, but we'll just say that they want it capped at 40. So there's this range of values for which they could come to an agreement, right? Both sides, if they, one side proposed some value in between 25 and 30 million, the other side would agree. So here's where we want to start talking about, well, what if there's optimism or pessimism? Because looking at each other, the league and the union don't know this. Right? So let's assume that the league is pessimistic about what the union wants, right? So let's assume that instead, like the blue, I'm kind of using the color blue to put where the real values are. But if the league is pessimistic and say, maybe they think that the union really will only accept values between 33 and, I don't know, 43 million. Well, then the league is going to look at this and say, there is no value in which we will ever agree, right? If they're pessimistic about what the union wants, there is no overlap in what, or at least in terms of the way they view it, there's no overlap in those contract zones. So under this situation, the league might actually, say, well, look, we're not going to come to an agreement anyways, so maybe I'll just propose something low, which would end up resulting in a lockout, right? Or potentially, even if they, so the pessimism here could lead to a bad outcome, right? There ends up being a lockout. But what if the pessimism isn't too bad, right? So let's think about that. So let's say instead, so I guess you can kind of think about here, we end up with a lockout if their beliefs, pessimistic beliefs, are that the union will only accept something between 33 and 43 million as the salary cap. What if they're not quite as pessimistic, and maybe, I don't know, let's say we'll use that 43 million again. I guess the way I have it drawn will be 44. And maybe they think that the lowest that they'll take is, I don't know, 28. So let's say they're not quite as pessimistic. Well, what might happen in this scenario? Well, if the league believes that the union won't take anything less than 28, maybe it proposes 28 million because it's okay with that value. It's not its favorite, most desirable value, but it's okay with that value. So it proposes 28 million. The actual offers the union would accept includes that, so they accept it. So pessimism can actually lead to the league hurting itself, right? Because then it ends up with a salary cap that's higher than it actually could have gotten away with. It could have proposed 25 and the union would have accepted it, right? So we have two types of pessimism. One, which really just hurts the league in terms of the value that they both agree on ends up being a little bit higher than it necessarily had to be. But if pessimism is too large, we may end up where both parties are hurt in that we end up with a lockout here. Okay? Let's do the same scenario. We'll use the same numbers down here. So we'll go, the league wants between 30 million and 20. Remember, the blue range here is the actual values they'd accept. And we have the union up here and the league down here. Okay? Separate these examples. So what if we have, it would work kind of vice versa well, right? If the union had pessimistic views about the highest value the league would take, we would have similar scenarios. So this was kind of our, I guess, this is where my spelling abilities comes out. So pessimism. I feel like I'm forgetting a C or something in there, but if you guys know how to spell it, then spell it correctly. So what if I have optimism, right? So let's say the league is optimistic about going into this bargaining with the union. So maybe they think, yeah, we always know the union wants a really high value to be the salary cap amount, but maybe I think, oh, it's supposed to be at the same point, so 40 million. But maybe they're like, I actually think that they'd be willing to take anything as low as 23 million as that salary cap. So this optimism by the league about what the union would be willing to accept, maybe they look at this and they go, well, if they're willing to take 23 million, maybe we'll throw them a bone. We'll offer kind of 24 because we're okay with that, right? But it's closer to 20 than 30 million, so we kind of still win out. The problem is if they offer that, the union is going to look at that and say, well, that's not one of the values we're willing to accept. We're going to go on strike, right? So this optimism about what the other side believes can kind of hurt the league as well. So you can be hurt by pessimism and by optimism. Right? Excuse me. However, if they get, we don't really have the kind of situation where the optimism can just kind of lead them to offering a higher amount, right? So anytime we have optimism from one side, it's just going to result in potentially, in this scenario, it was optimism from the league. So that led to a strike. If it was optimism by the union about the league, we would end up with potentially a lockout. So that's just kind of how we can start to think about what values are we going to arrive on, or how potentially, if we have optimism or pessimism about the other side, that's usually what results in these lockouts, or in this situation, right, the optimism led to a strike. Okay? So pessimism here led to a lockout. Here, when the league was optimistic, then that led to a strike. Any questions? Oh, I didn't realize this guy was covering this up. Any questions over any of that before we keep moving? Yeah.
So it's like they just actually don't have any that covers each other. They just go on strike, or what would happen?
Yeah, so if we had a situation like, yeah, we'd have a real problem, right? That's a good question. So if we had a situation like, I don't know, 20 to 30 million from the league, and then 35 million to 40 million from the union. Well, neither side could propose an amount to the other side with which they'd be okay, right? So we have a real problem, right? We're end up with a strike or a lockout here, unless over time, what do you think probably happens to the offers that the union's willing to accept if the league has a lockout for 3 years? Well, the union starts to probably play a little bit kinder, and they'd probably be willing to accept kind of a lower amount there, right? So then it becomes more of a dynamic issue where if there really was no overlap, well, for sure we're going to have some games not being played unless one side updates what they're willing to accept pretty quickly, right? So these things would change day to day potentially. Maybe the league comes into it saying these are the only values we'll accept. So originally they're like, yep, we're going to have a problem this season. Week goes by, the league starts looking at the numbers, it starts looking at some of the new revenue data coming in, and it says, well, look, the trend is increasing, revenues are way up, we predict revenues to be up in the future. Maybe we'd be okay paying, those top players a little bit more, kind of having that salary cap be a little higher, and maybe they shift kind of the amounts that they'd be willing to accept. So yeah, it would have to be that if we start out here, it becomes a dynamic issue where we'd have to start looking at it like over time. And if these don't change over time, I mean, it's kind of not a real practical, it's low probability of that occurring, but if it did, I guess the league would just kind of stop for a while, right? But you see this a lot, right? Like a lot of the times going into like a collective bargaining agreement where the union and the leagues are trying to make a deal, a lot of times they do start out in a situation like this, and it looks bleak. But then week by week, they kind of continually, each side is updating what offers they're willing to accept, and eventually end up with an agreement. All right. That's a good question, though. So I kind of got some of this lined out, the optimism and pessimism can lead to, but we had some examples of it. The other thing that we're thinking about, just a kind of a terminology, I didn't say this, but when we're looking at kind of these values here, right, we would call these like the threat points, like the value at which the contract zone stops, we would call those threat points. Okay. All right. So this was kind of the slide I left open. I guess I went through it a little bit in advance, but this was kind of what we just worked through a blank slide for. Okay. So in one of the examples there, I was mentioning this idea of kind of salary caps, right? So we've already talked about team level salary caps, but we could also have individual level salary caps. Right? So, excuse me, in the NBA, right? If we think about kind of a league or a team level salary cap, right? They actually have this rule where it's not a hard and fast number for every team. It's that players only are going to receive 49 to 51% of basketball-related income, right? So the league made this agreement with the union that, look, we're fine with paying higher wages, but we're going to set this salary cap so that any team can only spend approximately here, 50% of their income on their player salaries. So what types of teams does this benefit? Large market, right? Because 50% is 50%, right? So, or, it doesn't change by team, but 50% of a small market team's income is going to be a lot less than 50% of a large market team's income. So it doesn't really help us with any kind of competitive balance issues there by them setting the salary cap at this amount, which is kind of interesting, Like a lot of times, like in the models that we talked about earlier, these team level salary caps were made so that we could improve competitive balance and try to kind of decrease those larger markets expenditures on their salaries. But if we do it based off of a percentage, that doesn't change anything, right? So kind of interesting that the NBA has chosen to go that route. And then for the kind of the individual level player, salaries are going to be based off of kind of experience, right? So number of years in the league will kind of raise different salary cap maximums for players, right? So we think about that. There's a salary scale for how much they can pay that is based off of the experience of the players. What impact do we think this would have on rosters, right? So if the salary cap for an individual player kind of goes up for with the player's years of experience, what types of players am I going to want more of as a team then? What players can I get away with paying less, right? Those who have smaller years of experience. So we're going to see that the average age in a lot of these teams after this rule was instituted started to decrease, right? Because now if I want to go out and get kind of like a bench player who's been in the league for 10 years, well, that salary scale I have to pay them is kind of tied to their years of experience. I have to pay them more than if I go out and get a rookie or like a 1 year in the league player. So we kind of saw that this rule would reduce the overall average age. And NHL has a little bit higher of a percentage here. It kind of works the same way. What they did in terms of setting individual player salary caps is they didn't set a hard and fast number, but they said that you can't make more than 20% of your team's payroll. Right? So if you want to go out and kind of pay a superstar player a lot of money, they can't be more than 20% of your team's payroll. So, what types of teams is this going to benefit? Well, if I have a $200 million payroll as opposed to a $100 million payroll, I'm always going to have more room to play with, right? That 20% of 20 million is a much higher amount. So the highest quality players are going to want to go to the teams making the most revenue because they have the highest ability to pay them a larger amount of money, right? Players don't care if they're 10% or 30% of their team's payroll in terms of just the amount of money they're getting, right? However, they do care about, well, if that 10% of Team A's payroll is more than 20% of Team B's, I'm going to go with Team A, right? So this is, once again, this is going to be a rule that kind of hurts small market teams or benefits large market teams, however you want to look at it. So if we look at kind of the maximum salaries in the NHL, it's actually a little bit lower, right? Because one thing that this does avoid is a team can't go out and get one superstar player, right? If they go and do that, like let's say we didn't have this rule, okay? You can pay, a player whatever percent of your payroll you want. So maybe I go out and get a player, I spend 80% of my payroll on, if I'm in the NBA, maybe I go, sign a contract with LeBron James, and he's 80% of my team's payroll. What does that mean about the remaining roster that I probably have? It's probably not very good, right? I don't have a lot of money to go out and build a team around. So it kind of prevents, right, teams from wasting all of their money on one player and then kind of having like a superstar player on an average team. Because, the league doesn't want that. The league wants the best player in the league to be on probably one of the better teams, right? Because that's where the highest amount of revenue is going to be earned. So this rule kind of prevents that, right? Kind of prevents that scenario that I just painted. If we think about kind of the differences in the NFL, I forget all the rules here, but basically, the percent that you can spend on your players depends on how much of your revenue comes from different sources. So like, it's a certain percent of, it's some equation, how much revenue I make from ticket revenue versus, naming rights, apparel sales, like all these different things. But ultimately, the real interesting thing about the NFL is that there's no individual salary limits, right? So any one player, right, there's no cap on how much they can be paid. Right? If they, Patrick Mahomes, right, where they just went out and signed, and it was a 10-year deal for 450 million. Am I remembering these right? I feel like it was about 45 million a year, right? So there's no real cap on how much any one player can make in a given year. They also kind of allow you can have bonuses that don't kind of count as part of the salary. So these signing bonuses have really become something that's really popular because even though there's no individual salary limits, there's still team level limits in which you can't go over the salary cap. Your team can't go over the cap overall. So what do? Well, if I give someone a $40 million contract, that goes against the cap. I don't have as much money to go out and spend. However, if I give them a $10 million contract and $30 million in possible bonuses, the value to the player, if they think that they're going to perform well, is still $40 million. But only $10 million of that goes against the cap. So you can kind of think about, like, one thing that we might see start playing out more is if I'm like a top level quarterback in the NFL, right? And I'm going to sign a deal. Now, I do want to make money, but maybe we think about someone at the end of their career. So they do want to make a good amount of money. They do want an offer that has the highest kind of wage there, the highest income, but they also want to win. So if that's what, I care about both those things equally, what might you see those top level quarterbacks starting to do? Probably see a higher percent of the deals they start making be composed of bonuses, right? Now, early in their career, right, they may want to win, but they're like, I got 15 years to do that, 10 to 15 years, and so I want to make sure I get that first big contract. But subsequent contracts, if I want to make sure the team around me is high quality, I don't want a lot of my contract to be a salary cap hit. So you'd start to see the composition of these contracts they sign be a higher percent of bonuses as opposed to kind of this guaranteed money. Okay? Now, lower quality players, we don't really probably think of this issue arising as much because, if my contract is a pretty small amount, a small hit against the cap isn't a big deal. It's just when I start getting like these $30, $40 million contracts, well, now it starts to become a big deal if all of that goes against the cap. So these bonuses have become kind of a real popular thing because they don't go against the cap. Just to kind of mention how these work, it's not like the bonuses are necessarily guaranteed. So there is a risk to the player, right? If I get, say, an initial bonus from leading the league in sacks, well, that's not even if I am like the best defensive end or whatever, it's not a guarantee I'm going to lead the league in sacks. So I'm taking a risk by having more of my contract be composed of bonuses. And the league is also taking a risk, right? Like they might think, well, look, you might not have to pay that player as much, right? But if they end up leading the league in sacks, then they have to pay them this kind of huge bonus. So both sides are kind of taking a risk. But really, kind of the players are kind of taking a risk on themselves, right? They're kind of, and you could argue this is a good or a bad thing, right? Should players want to kind of be incentivized more to have these bonuses? Well, I mean, look, we're all probably a little bit, especially professional athletes, I'm sure all have somewhat of an overinflated ego about their own abilities, right? I mean, they are easily in the top 1% probably of what they do. And so, is that good that they're making decisions that potentially are risky instead of kind of getting these guaranteed amounts? I mean, it's a little bit of a moral issue there, whether or not you think that's okay. If I was in charge of the NFL Players Union, I would probably try to be bargaining for some of these bonuses amounts not to be as high, or trying to work something out to where the bonuses weren't as attractive to the teams, because the teams are going to be very realistic about the players' chances. Players, when they go to sign a deal, are going to be a little bit more optimistic about what their own abilities are. So that's kind of a side issue, but So all these are kind of things we've been talking about that can impact players' wages, right? That we see. We see the actual data. Where are we at on time? So I want to save. I'll mention this, and I think we might go to do some stuff in Excel. So rival leagues can also impact wages, lead to higher wages, but why? Well, basically, it just eliminates monopsony power. We've worked through enough models where we've seen that, monopsony power is going to lead to lower wages. What's one way to eliminate that monopsony power? If we see competing leagues. Okay? Now, we don't really see this today, right? If we go back far enough, we talked about things like the NBA and the ABA, which eventually merged, National and American League. But if you ever get kind of a competing league that can have success, you can eliminate monopsony power, okay? And this is kind of it's not a perfect example, but can you think of any other example where maybe you had a competing league and it's led to players that otherwise would have played for low wages end up making more money? So I don't know how many of you kind of follow basketball or the NBA or just kind of basketball in general. And this isn't a perfect example because it's not professional basketball at the NBA level. But if you go back 20 years, maybe a little bit further, before we had rules about you couldn't enter, if you had to go play college basketball, you couldn't make it into the league out of high school in the NBA. Your only option was really NCAA basketball. So I can't remember how many years ago now it was, but certain players started going from high school instead of going to college basketball, where their wages are essentially, you could think of them as almost zero, but they're getting a free tuition. You could add that up, how much that ends up being. We started seeing some players going overseas to play, right? Because essentially, once there was a league in which it was raising as much revenue, maybe not in the U.S., but globally, right? And you start to see these really large contracts being paid, and you start to see players kind of leave, which ends up, there's a competing league. Well, if the NCAA can't pay me a higher wage, they're not allowed to, I'm just going to leave. Right? And in response to that, the NCAA now allows there to be kind of, not like players actually being paid wages, but there are certain, what do they call it? I think it's like stipends or something that the athletes can receive. And it's not a lot of money, but at least they've kind of caved in because there's this competing league, right? They're eliminating some of that monopsony power. Now, we probably don't have a perfect example. Like I said, that one's not perfect, but yeah, XFL, when they kind of started to make that rise back, is another one. You might have seen some NFL contracts, probably not for top tier players, but some of those kind of lower level players in the NFL were probably able to kind of bargain for higher wages because otherwise they might have left to go play in the XFL. Maybe like your backup quarterbacks would have left to go play or something like that. Yeah, it was a good example. So we've already talked about kind of how could rival leagues raise wages, but rival leagues could also lower wages. But how? Well, think about it. If we look at the product market, right, the value of the games being played, if I eliminate that monopoly power by a competing league, well, what has changed? I had it written down earlier. So if I eliminate the monopoly power of a team or of the NFL by having the XFL, a competing league, what happens to the marginal revenue per win? Well, once I eliminate monopoly power, the marginal revenue per win actually goes down, which means the value of my labor has now also went down. If we see a decrease in the demand curve, it's going to lead to lower wages. So although in theory it might seem very obvious, well, yeah, if we got a competing league, the monopsony power is gone, my wage will go back up. Well, maybe, because even though that monopsony power kind of hurts you, the demand for your labor is as high as it is because that league is a monopoly and can keep that marginal revenue per win high. So there's kind of some competing effects there. Okay. I think we'll probably end on that. Let me think. We'll go through that stuff in next class and kind of a fun discussion at the beginning. But I do want to kind of show you this because I always thought this was like one of my favorite graphs. It's very interesting, right? So, there are individual player salary caps. in a lot of leagues, and I said the NFL doesn't have one, but what they did institute was kind of this rookie salary cap maximum, because the league was having these players come in that were being drafted high and they were signing outrageous contracts, right? There was no limit on how much one player could make. Well, the problem was a lot of these teams who have the high picks are your worst quality teams, right? So if they take a chance on someone, pay them all this money, and they end up not working out, well, now they were a low quality team that now has a huge contract, that they have to pay, and they'll have as much money to kind of improve it. So the league was like, well, look, this is killing competitive balance, right? We're getting teams kind of stagnant, consistently at the bottom of our league. So how can we prevent that? Well, we know they're going to be getting these top quality draft picks, and hopefully those players end up being really high quality players once they make it into the NFL. But let's lower the amount that they can be paid. That way, when they do work out, well, now the team is able to have a player who they're actually paying less than what that player's bringing in terms of additional revenue. And if they don't work out, well, at least they're not tied to this massive, massive contract. So you can kind of see, I forget the exact year when it was instituted. It was sometime in between 2011 and 2015. So, looks like I have it here, sorry, 2011. So 2010 is this red line, and you're going to have all the draft picks and how much their kind of average annual salary would have been. So notice kind of some of these top players, on average, were making, I'm guessing this is 13 million kind of a year, which might sound like a ton, but for a player that you're not sure is going to work out, right, that's a big deal. And so after they institute kind of this rookie salary maximum in 2015, if we look at the salaries, average annual salaries of the players, notice how much kind of lower they are, right? And you have here, players that still we're not sure if have worked out yet, like Jameis Winston, but at least the team, even if that player didn't really work out for the team that drafted him, well, at least unlike Sam Bradford from the team that drafted him, they didn't have to pay almost $10 million more a year, right? So this is always kind of a nice graph to really show what the impact of this rookie salary cap maximum was. All right. So, I didn't want to do that. What I wanted to do was pull up this file that was on Canvas that I tried last Thursday to do, which is class basketball regressions, right? So, I went in, and I don't know what was going on Thursday, because this week when I've been using this laptop, it's always worked. So we go to File, Options, Add-ins. Manage add-ins. You could hit Go, make sure Analysis Toolpack is selected. And now under your Data tab, there should be this Data Analysis option. Okay? So I had a bunch of different data here. I think we'll go to Tournament, right? A more simplified data set. I'll zoom in a little bit so it's easier for us to see all this data. Oh. Where did everything go? There we go. So I've got different years. There were schools attached to these names, but I ended up not copying the names of the schools just so we could focus on kind of the data. So I've got different years, the total number of undergraduates at that school, what their basketball team expenses were, basketball team revenue, did they make the tournament in the previous year, the previous number of undergraduates, and it's kind of some I won't play around too much with this variable, but it was the average ACT score of the school in the year before. And then 1, if they made any round of the tournament, 0 if not, and then kind of the total number of wins they had in the tournament here I have as another variable. So one thing that might be interesting is, okay, if I make it into any round of the tournament, right, is that impacted by how much I was spending on my basketball program, right? So I'm interested in how do basketball expenses impact whether or not I make the tournament. So thinking about kind of the linear regression that I'm going to want to look at there is going to be, I think that whether or not I make or I'm in any round of the tournament, which basically is just kind of a 1 if I make it into the tournament, 0 if not, I think it's going to be some function of the amount of money or the basketball expenses of that school. So I run this regression, I end up with this coefficient estimate for B. that's going to tell me the impact of one more additional dollar spent on my basketball program on the probability of making the tournament, right? Whenever we have a 1-0 variable, which is essentially what this is, the coefficient interpretation is a 1 unit increase in the x variable causes the predicted y variable to go up by whatever this is. Well, the y variable can only go from 0 to 1, so increases in the y variable is basically increases in the probability that this variable is a 1. Okay? So how can I do this in Excel? So I've got my data analysis tool here. I click on it. I can't zoom in on this, but scroll down. Here's regression. I hit OK. So my y variable, remember, was did they make any round of the tournament? So I'm going to click on this cell. Kind of a reminder. I think I mentioned this earlier in the semester, but if I hold Control-Shift or on a Mac Command-Shift and hit the down arrow, it's going to select that entire variable for me. So I hit Enter. What's the X variable that I wanted to look at? Well, that was team basketball expenses. Excuse me. Excuse me. So I hold Control-Shift and down arrow or Command-Shift down arrow on a Mac, and I've got everything I needed. So I'm going to click right here, and it sends me back to the screen. I selected the labels, so I want to make sure I selected those. If I don't, it's going to give me this error, right? So I'll select the labels, right? And then I'll hit OK. So it's going to create a different sheet for me, right? And it's going to give me this output. So let's take a look at that. So we've got a lot of different statistics here, right? But the ones that really, for the sake of what we're doing, we're going to focus on is really what that coefficient estimate is. Now, this seems really weird. I mean, 7.9 e to the negative 8. I think I also mentioned earlier in the semester, right? This e to the negative 8 basically just means move the decimal point. So if it's negative, move that decimal point 8 places to the left. So this is going to be like what? 0.000000079. Right? Why is this so low? Well, because just think about how is our x variable measured? Dollars. So a 1 unit increase is a $1 increase. If I spend $1 more on my basketball program, it's not going to impact the probability I make the NCAA tournament by very much, right? It's going to raise the probability by an incredibly small amount. So what's probably more interesting is, okay, well, what's the impact of spending an additional $1 million, right? Well, if this is the effect of $1, how can I get the effect of $1 million? Just multiply it by 1 million, right? And then whatever this would be the impact of an additional $1 million spent on my basketball program. Okay? So I can use my coefficient estimates to find kind of the different predicted increases in my y variable. Okay? I'm going to also go ahead and look at this and say, okay, well, what's the p-value here? We've talked about this before. The p-value is really low. Okay? So my p-value is e to the negative 773. This is pretty much a p-value of 0. And we said if the p-value is less than alpha, and these alphas we set are usually 0.1, 0.05, and 0.01. Right? This is kind of like the stars that we see in the paper, whether or not something is statistically significant. Well, if I have a p-value of approximately 0, it's going to be less than all these alphas. This is a statistically significant estimate at every single confidence level, right? With 90, 95, 99% confidence, I can say that the true relationship between basketball team expenses and whether or not they make the tournament, that there's a significant positive relationship. It's different than 0, statistically different from 0, right? Not only different from 0, it's positive, okay? Any questions on anything up to that point? Okay, so now I'll kind of show you a couple other issues. Go back to that tournament worksheet. So let's say, okay, I know expenses matter, but maybe whether or not I have a larger school also matters, right? So maybe the number of undergraduates, if I have a higher number of undergraduates, I'm just going to have to spend more money to have like a larger arena, and maybe that doesn't improve the quality of my team per se. So I want to include multiple variables kind of on my right-hand side, or multiple X variables. And maybe I don't just want the total number of undergraduates, because like, the total undergraduates this year, like the NCAA tournament kind of plays out, and then decisions about to attend the school are really from the following fall, right? So maybe I want to control for the previous number of undergraduates. Well, I'm going to have an issue if I'm going to do this regression in Excel, which is that you have to have the variables you include on the right-hand side next to each other. So I want to include expenses and the previous number of undergraduates. Well, they're not in concurrent columns. That's going to be an issue. So what I'll do is, and I have all this data filtered already, and for those of you, I've still got a couple more stragglers I'm sending them out to, which I'm hoping to get everyone's kind of data out there tomorrow. I've got a whole day to kind of work on those and get the last couple out. But anytime I'm sending you these, I'm trying to remember, and I think I've remembered so far for everyone, to filter to do this for you. But basically, if I want to select this entire data set, so I'm going to go to the very first cell, hold Control Shift, hit over, and then down. It's going to select the entire data set. I'm then going to go to Data, and see this filter option is already selected here. I'm going to make sure that I select it. It's then going to add these little kind of filter things at the top. So, I could, won't play around with this too much, but I could look at every single different value that's in this in this variable. Notice the year, I'm going to have like, oh, okay, this goes from 2003 to 2012. And I can get some pretty quick descriptives about this, the data using that, like what are the potential values I'm just going to see for this variable. But once I have it filtered, now it makes sure that like if I move something, or I filter it, and let's say I range it from smallest to largest, it moves every observation, like the whole line, it moves together. So make sure that the data stays correct. But the thing I want to do is make sure my basketball expenses are next to this pre-undergraduate. So what I'm going to do is then I'm going to right-click and insert a column. I'm going to go select this column over here and then just drag it next to that team expenses. It's probably the easiest way to do it. And then I can go ahead, right-click, and delete that column. Now when I go to run this regression, I'm going to select my Y variable, which was did they make any round of the tournament? So Control Shift or Command Shift on a Mac down arrow. But my X variables now, I want basketball expenses and previous number of undergraduates, right? So I'll select both of those variables. I selected the labels, put it on a new worksheet, hit OK. Now I've got the impact of one more additional dollar spent on my basketball program, on the probability of making the tournament. Notice it didn't change very much, right? It was like, what was it before? I mean, it was pretty much the same thing. So there wasn't a large impact by including this additional control variable. But, if I had the right, additional control variables, it might influence that estimate quite a bit. So we go, back to the tournament data. Maybe I say, well, okay, well, I will also want to include controls for what the team revenue was, and did they make the tournament the previous year? So this is some measure of like, okay, well, what was the quality of the team the year before? So now, I just start including, oh, come on, Zoom. I want to select my data tab. Yeah, there we go. So now when I go to run this regression, for my X variables, I'm just going to select all of these four. Right, so I'm just including additional controls. Right? I'm going to hit OK. Now when I look at the output, now I can see that, okay, it's changed a little. It was 7.9 before. Now it's down to 2.1. Right? So its impact, the estimate I get is impacted a lot because I wasn't controlling for other things. Now the interpretation is not just the effect of one more dollar on the kind of predicted change in the probability I make the tournament. It's holding these other things constant. This is the impact of one more additional dollar. So the thought experiment is two schools with the same number of undergraduates the prior year, the same basketball revenue, and both either made the tournament the year before or they both didn't, right? So they're starting to look a lot, it's like we're comparing apples to apples more now, right? So for those, this thought experiment for two schools like that, if one of them spent one more additional dollar, here's the impact on the probability of making the tournament, right? So the more controls we can include, it starts to have a little bit more meaning. Now, there's more issues. If some of you have taken econometrics, we can start to think about, if I include more controls that, I don't just have an R squared, I've got my adjusted R squared, am I really picking up more of the variation? But that's kind of outside the scope of this course. For the sake of this course, the most, and most of the time, it's always good to include as many controls as you can, right? Especially when you have relatively large data sets, okay? Let me think. Let me see what I had in the slides. So there's probably some additional things I wanted to point out here. Oh, this is for next week. I'll save this for next week. So another thing I wanted to point out with this Excel file was I separated things out into different divisions. So this is another thing that might be something you want to do with either your projects or just in general for other classes if you're working with Excel. So maybe I go, which one do I want here? Let's go to this reg season one. Right? So I've got here, I kept the school names apparently and a bunch of other information. So first thing I'm going to do, Control Shift, over, down, go to data, and make sure I'm filtering the data. Okay? So maybe I think that there's different impacts on Division I versus Division II schools. So I have Division I and Division II schools here, right? Well, I could include an indicator, but for the sake of what we've done in this class, we haven't dealt with interaction terms a lot, and I wouldn't kind of expect you to do that. And it probably is better to use them, but another way you could do this is say, okay, look, I'm going to run this regression and look at the impact of basketball expenses on whether or not they made the tournament. Well, I don't have that variable here. So basketball expenses on the number of regular season games they won. I think that's what I have kind of over here, right? So the impact of basketball team expenses on the number of regular season wins. But I think that maybe expenses on my basketball program matter more for a D1 versus a D2 school, right? Or vice versa, right? So what you could do is go over to this filter option, hit select all, so it deselects everything, hit Division I, right? So now it's only going to show you Division I schools, right? So then what I'm going to do is Control Shift, select what it looks like the entire data set, but it's only what's appearing to me. So now I can copy this. I'll go over to a different worksheet. I'll paste this. Now I only have Division I schools on this worksheet. I'll then go back to my original data, deselect Division I, and now I only want to look at Division II schools. Once again, Control Shift, over, down, copy. Now I'm going to paste these on another worksheet. Now I have essentially split my data set up into two different data sets, one with only Division I, one with Division II. But I also, in doing it this way, I kept the original data to where I can always go back and look at the original data with Division I and Division II schools, okay? Now, potentially I could run one regression for Division I schools, run another for Division II, and then compare those coefficient estimates and see which one of these divisions does it matter more for to spend, have an increase in my expenses in my basketball program. And I use Division I, Division II here. You could break this down by a lot of different things. So, it'll be kind of specific to your individual question and data set, what you might be able to break it down and run separate regressions for. Okay. Any questions on anything that I just did there? Okay, I want to show you another useful technique with the filter tool. So here I have just a mess of data. I don't even know everything that's in here. So I'm going to hit Control Shift, hit over and down. So I select the entire data set. I'm going to filter it, and I'm going to go back up to the top. Okay. So one issue you're going to have if you try to go to run a regression, and I believe that I've tried to remember to do this for every data set I'm sending out. But if you did some of the data collection on your own, I reached out to some of you and how you do parts of it on your own, you might have some missing values. And if I try to go run a regression, basically if I'm trying to use a variable where there's missing values, it's going to return to me an error. Okay. So what's the easiest way to kind of identify where those missing values are? So let's say, I'm going to try to find one where it wouldn't be obvious that we had a missing value. Forget which variable. So I think it's like the ACT ones. There we go. So go up to the top, and I don't know. Maybe I'm looking at some of this, and let's say like these two observations didn't exist, and like for the first 15 observations, it looks like there's no missing values, but once I get down to like line 300, I start to miss some values, right? If I go to use this filter option, anytime I see blanks, that's telling me there's an observation in my data that is missing. It's missing for this variable. So what I could do is just select the blanks, right? And then go over, Control Shift. Here I have a kind of goofy data set, so I'm going to go all the way over to the end. This is the one I didn't clean. There we go. Hit the down arrow. Now I've got all the observations for which I was missing that one variable. Because I don't want to just I can't put values in there, right? So I have to just delete them. I can't use them in this analysis. Now, what I would suggest is whenever you have that original raw data, like the original data set like I have here, don't delete this. Don't delete it on here because you want to keep that raw data in case you want to use it for something else. So it's okay to use this method to find the blanks and then delete them. But what I would suggest is, now I have to find which of these variables I was looking at. Well, there we go. I just Control Z, so I undo what I did. I would copy and paste this onto a different worksheet, then go in, find the blanks, and delete them. That way, you now have the original raw data, and you have a data set where you've gotten rid of those blanks for that variable that you wanted to use. And this matters because sometimes if you want to run two regressions, well, sometimes I'll have a variable for which there is no blanks. So maybe I want to run one regression with, the number of female undergraduates here, maybe as a control, but then I want to run another regression that has the female undergraduates as well as, I don't know, the offensive rating here. Well, it's missing for a lot of schools. Okay, so I can run one regression only including the number of female undergraduates, and then once I copy and paste this onto a different worksheet and delete all the blanks, then I can use that kind of smaller data set and have both female undergraduates and this offensive rating, right? So I want to make sure that I don't delete it from the original raw data. I copy and paste my original data set into a different worksheet and then delete the blanks, okay? Any questions on that? And I'm saying this for the sake of what we're doing in this course. In practice, like, there's other ways of dealing with missing values. For the sake of what we're doing, that's how we're going to do it, right? And if these missing values tended to be a certain type of schools, this might impact our analysis a little bit, which like I said, that's more of an econometric kind of course issue. I'm really just trying to get you to kind of use some simple linear regressions and some simple kind of basically data cleaning or kind of work with data. Okay. Any other questions on this? Okay. Any other questions in general? Just about things kind of coming up. I do want to do one more thing, and then we'll get out of here. So I have it somewhere in here. And we're just kind of prefacing next week. We're going to finish up kind of wages, but we're going to dive into wages and the issues of discrimination that exist. So this will be, this is really interesting, kind of the next topic we have. So I went out and did this one. So if you were to look at the NCAA football championship, where there's basically, right, you've got 4 teams, 2 teams play, and the winner plays each other, right? So the number of different ways you could choose a 4-team kind of bracket like that ends up being, and then this is just the different number of combinations, right? So it ends up being 2, because there's always 2 teams playing, and then kind of to the power of however many games. So 2 to the 3rd power, right? So like you could, and with this, it's easier if you wanted to, you could prove this to yourself. Write down team 1, team 2, team 3, team 4. Think of all the different combinations of the winners you could select from the 2 semifinals and then the final game, and there'd be 8 different combinations. If you want to do that for a 64 team, it's basically the same thing, but now you've got 2 to the kind of, sorry, there's 63 games to choose. Why did I do 63? Was I just not thinking? Yeah, I don't know what I was doing there. 64. Oh, no, this is right. Because here we had 4 teams, right? The final game, you only have, you have 1 final winner. So for 4 teams, you have 3 games being played. For 64 teams, you end up with only 63 games being played. So it becomes 2 to the 63rd. So there's this many different ways you can choose a possible NCAA tournament bracket. Now, a lot of them are more unlikely to occur than others, but those are the different number of possible combinations. So if you were just choosing one of those combinations, the odds of having a perfect bracket is like nothing. I mean, next to nothing. Now, that's assuming that the 50% chance either team wins, which is not the case in most games. So if you factor in kind of using, I went out and I didn't do this specifically, but there was someone that went through, grabbed like all the years of NCAA tournament data and looked at, based on the seeding, what percent of the time did this team win? So trying to factor in like how likely, some games are more likely that this team wins versus others. The odds of actually still picking a perfect bracket is what, 1 over 128 billion, right? So still pretty low odds. So, to get one person that gets it right, we would need 128 billion brackets. I don't know if that's how many brackets we had this year, but everything I've heard, there's not a perfect bracket left. So we apparently didn't get enough different of the combinations out there. But it is interesting to think about just how unlikely it is that you really would get all of these correct. Yeah, so I thought it was kind of interesting when to bring it up before we end the class. Other than that, like I said, keep an eye out in your email or on Canvas for any comment I made on your project proposal. I know a couple of you, I made a comment, I still haven't heard back, and I'm starting to get some people kind of lingering, I didn't see it, or I forgot to respond. So I've got a lot of data sets kind of sent out, and I should be wrapping up the rest of them this week. And we're kind of transitioning from towards the end of this course, thinking a little bit more about that project. So hopefully you've kind of been working on the lit review portion, the economic principles, and now we're kind of making sure that we'll kind of working on that final kind of data portion of it, okay? All right, I will see you guys again on Tuesday. And look for that online quiz that'll be due before we meet in class on Tuesday as well.